A pleasure to be here today with Dara, a scholar and an author, most recently known for her best-selling book of People Love Dead Jews, which you'll be able to access a recording of later as well. And today we're going to talk about her book written about 15 years ago, All Other Nights, which is a novel, fascinating novel, about Jewish spies on both sides of the Civil War. So to first tell me, why did you write that? That's such an interesting topic.
So I decided to pursue this topic. This sounds so bonkers now, but 15 years ago, because of how polarized the country was then, which is absurd when you think about it. It hasn't gotten better, has it? And sort of thinking about how many of the conflicts in our country really kind of go back to the Civil War. When you think about red states and blue states, it kind of follows the Mason-Dixon line. And thinking about also, and I was looking at sort of how what's true. It's like Jews are like other Americans, maybe only more so, and sort of the polarization in the Jewish community. Again, laughable that this was something I was thinking about 15 years ago. But then I sort of, looking into the divisions in the Jewish community in the Civil War, and I sort of came out with this really interesting picture. So I don't know if you want me to go into detail about that now. Yeah. Sure. So, it's a small Jewish community. If you look at 1860, there were about 150,000 Jews in the United States. And unsurprisingly, the largest Jewish community then was in New York City. But the second largest Jewish community then was in New Orleans. So this really was a community that was on both sides of the Civil War. But what's really interesting to me about this is that at the time of the beginning of this, when these states started to secede from the Union, there were a lot of national church groups that divided when the country divided. So that's why even to this day you have Southern Methodist, Southern Baptist. That's because those national organizations, they had they had a convention, an annual convention, they had a referendum about slavery or secession, and half the people walked out, made their own church across the street. What's really interesting though is that the Jewish community at that time, there were national Jewish organizations. B'nai B'rith already existed. There were a couple other organizations that no longer exist today. None of them split at the time of the Civil War.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
And the reason for that is because if you think about it, in 1860, most Americans lived in the same place their parents had lived. They were farming the same land their parents farmed. Most people didn't really leave their town. It was not a very mobile population, except for American Jews. Because American Jews mostly had come to this country from places either in Latin America or in Central Europe where they hadn't been allowed to own land. They were mostly running businesses rather than farming. And so when you have a business, you need a distribution network. You need a way to get goods and services to one place to another. You need a network. And so when the country divided, unlike a lot of their neighbors, a lot of Jews in both sides of the Civil War had a little bit more empathy for the people on the other side because they knew people on the other side. And that was sort of there was this intimacy to the experience of this community that was really fascinating and I thought really familiar to us as American Jews today.
So interesting. And were there by and large more Jewish abolitionists, more Jewish slave owners, or more who just apathetic in between? What was the breakdown roughly?
I mean, I wish I could say all Jews were abolitionists. Unfortunately, it really came down to where people lived. And I think that a lot of this has to do with a lot of fears that diaspora Jews have in whatever place they live, where they feel that they need to demonstrate their enthusiasm for whoever's in charge of the place where they live. This is sort of a survival strategy for Jewish communities. You have active abolitionists and you have people who are slave owners. And that's true, in both communities. What's interesting is you have rabbinic leadership, and there you have rabbis who are outspoken abolitionists, and you have rabbis who are pro-slavery. And some of those people don't live where you think they would live. Actually, one of the most outspoken pro-slavery rabbis was a rabbi named Morris Raffal, who was in B'nai Jeshurun congregation in New York City, which is to me very funny because that today is very known for being a really progressive congregation, but was a pro-slavery rabbi in New York City. Yeah. And one of the most outspoken abolitionist rabbis was a man named David Einhorn, who was in Baltimore, which was technically in the north, but was a very southern sympathizing city. So a lot of these people were not where you think they'd be. And, but very, as you can imagine, a lot of vociferous debate.
So what do the religious arguments look like on both sides? If you're pro-slavery and you're a rabbi giving a drasha, what are you rooting that in? And if you're anti-slavery, what are you rooting that in, by and large?
Well, so, the irony is that the pro-slavery arguments are very similar to what you saw in Christian communities at that time, where they're like, well, it's like the people, we think of the, Torah as this liberation document.
Right.
There is, however, there are some rules about slave ownership that come up like in, after the Exodus.
Yeah.
So they go to those and are like, look, even the Torah says you can own slaves. I mean, it's absurd because in the Torah, it's more like indentured servitude. It's like a 7-year contract, and then you have to free the person if they don't refuse to go free and yell them to the wall. I mean, it's absurd. But it's a lot of the same apologetics that their Christian neighbors were doing. And of course, the abolitionist arguments, I mean, you don't have to go far to understand where those are coming from in the Torah tradition.
Yeah. So how did you choose the characters to use in the novel? Like, and do I understand correctly? These were real life people?
Well, so the characters are based on real people. A few of them are actual historical figures. So, for example, there was a man named Judah Benjamin, who was the Secretary of State of the Confederacy, who was Jewish. He was one of the first Jewish senators. He had been a senator from Louisiana. He was actually on the verge of being nominated for a seat on the Supreme Court. He would have been the first Jewish Supreme Court justice, but then these states seceded from the Union, and he decided to throw in his lot with the Confederacy. It's a really fascinating. I mean, this guy was on the Confederate $2 bill.
Wow.
Is the most bizarre. There's so many bizarre things about his life. I could tell you the story of his escape from the Confederacy is also bonkers. So he's a real person who's in the book. The other people are based on their composites of other figures. So there's a couple of the story is the main character in the story is a Jewish soldier in the Union Army who is his commanders find out that his family, he's from this like business family in New York, and he basically enlisted in the army to run away from an arranged marriage. And his commanders find out that he has these family ties in New Orleans, including to this person who's planning to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. And this is based on a real assassination plot. So this is an example of like how I sort of merged these people. Abraham Lincoln actually had a very close Jewish friend, a man named Abraham Jonas, who was a fellow lawyer with him, who was in northern Kentucky, and then Abraham Jones was from northern Kentucky, was a lawyer, then moved to southern Illinois where he befriended Lincoln. He was instrumental in getting Lincoln the nomination to the Supreme Court. To the Republican.
He was public about his Judaism?
Oh yes, absolutely. And he had 10 sons. All his Kentucky-born sons ended up serving in the Confederate Army, and his Union-born son ended up serving in the Union Army. What's amazing is that he found out from one of his Kentucky-born sons who had moved to New Orleans about a plot to assassinate Lincoln on the way to the inauguration in 1861. And this son of his, even though he was such a loyal Confederate that he ended up serving as an officer in the Confederate Army, he overheard people in a tavern talking about this plot to assassinate Lincoln, and he felt like he had to warn his father's friend. So he wrote a letter to his father, and then Jonas tipped off Lincoln. So it's like, so I took these sort of elements and I sort of turned them into and then there's another later. So that's the first part of the story is my main character is sent to New Orleans to assassinate this person who's involved in this plot to kill Lincoln. And he's basically does this at a Passover Seder, which is why this is called All Other Nights. So I won't tell you how that plot ends up, but then things get worse for my main character where he's sent his commanders then are like, we have another thing for you to infiltrate. It's this ring of spies in Virginia. It's this group of sisters, and then he sort of balks at this. He's like, you're really going to have me assassinate a woman? And then his commanders are like, oh no, don't worry. We don't want you to murder her. We want you to marry her. And he infiltrates his way into this group of sisters. And that's also based on, there's a few different people I based that on. So there's a woman named, there's this couple that I was thinking about named, there's a woman named Eugenia Levy Phillips and her husband, I could not make this up, Philip Phillips. This was a couple. Philip Phillips was a Jewish man who served in Congress as a representative from Alabama. And he was a Northern sympathizer. He voted against the secession, didn't want to secede. His wife, Eugenia Levy Phillips, was a fire-breathing rebel who she was a Confederate spy. And she ended up being imprisoned by the Union Army when they took over New Orleans, where they were living at the time. So it's sort of like this bizarre, but yet they stayed married. They had 9 children together. I mean, it's like, and her husband ended up bailing her out of prison. I mean, it's this like weird sort of loyalties that are playing back and forth, which I was winding together into these characters.
So perhaps a last question for you of polarization today in the American Jewish community or global Jewish community. Can this novel shed any light on that? Like, how does this novel, or your thinking in general, kind of help us to think about that issue now?
I think that what you see, what I found looking into this is that, it's very, looking back at this, obviously we see this entirely in moral terms. There's a good side and an evil side, and that is just true, right? There's no way I'm not making any defense against slaveholders or anything like that. What I thought was interesting in studying this, though, was seeing how these people were able to sort of maintain these ties with each other despite having this vast moral divide. That was what was interesting to me. So, like, for example, when the Union Army takes over parts of Tennessee, which, by the way, the Jews were expelled from Tennessee. That's also this bizarre episode in Jewish history. It's the only time Jews were ever expelled from American territory. When the Union Army takes over Tennessee, you have these Jewish Union soldiers who are then welcomed into Southern Jewish homes for like Shabbat and holiday meals. Yeah. No one else is like inviting the enemy over for dinner, right? That's not happening, right? And then the same thing on the opposite side, like when you have Southern Jewish soldiers who are in prison as prisoners of war in Illinois and in other places in the North, those local Jewish communities in those places were bringing those prisoners matzah for Passover, and visiting them in the prison. It's like nobody else is like bringing care packages to the prisoners of war from the the enemy. It's sort of this bizarre thing where they're sort of able to sort of move above this, and then of course they use that to move forward after the war ends. And to me, this was really interesting. It was like interesting to look, and I think that in this time of polarization, we have. It's only gotten worse since I wrote this book. It's not just polarization in terms of like stark moral divides, which there's often very good reasons for stark moral divides. Like I said, no one's defending slavery. But what's interesting to me is that we now live in this culture where there's this sort of premium on if I feel you're supporting something that's morally abhorrent to me. My correct move in terms of how I should relate to you is that I shouldn't relate to you at all. Right? I'm not going to engage with you at all. And like, it's a moral stance to not engage with you at all. What I think is really interesting is you look at these Jewish communities of the Civil War, and especially after the Civil War, and it's like, there just aren't enough of them. Like, they don't have a choice of like, they can't cancel people. It's like, there's this Union soldier, he needs somewhere to go for Pesach. He's sitting alone in Tennessee. You're not going to invite him to your Seder. Or the opposite. There's these, on the other side, right? It's sort of this like, it's interesting to me how there's this possibility of I wouldn't say seeing past differences because it's so much more than differences, but how there's some possibility of maintaining a relationship, and the relationship itself is the moral clarity and enables a space for the moral clarity. And that's sort of like, and that's the way you change minds, right? That's really and so for if you're passionate about whatever it is that moral clarity that you have, share that moral clarity.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So that's a moral point around persuasion and relationship.
Yes,
and it's
relationship
also a point,
building. Yes,
it's also a point about how the Jewish community can, to some degree, transcend like the American partisanship divides, that we can be immersed in it but also be something beyond it to some degree.
Well, because we know these people. That was what was so interesting about this Civil War example, is how intimate this community is. Like, it's so intimate. It's like these people are in each other's families. They're business partners. They're married to each other. Like, they're literally married to. It's like one person is a Northern sympathizer married to a Confederate spy. It's the most bonkers thing. But that's the way human relationships work.
Yes.
And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we pretend that that's not how human relationships work.
Amazing. Friends, check out All Other Nights and significant, amazing, groundbreaking books by Dara Horn as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.